Hey everyone, Scott Peterson with the Northwest Gas Association. I want to introduce someone I've known for a long time, and I think maybe most people on the webinar know Ralph, but he spent many years with IGI and BP and has moved on to RNG development, which is exciting. Currently with Sustainable Energy Ventures, and is still working in the Pacific Northwest, but I think going back and forth to California, maybe some warm place in California on the occasion. But 35 years in the energy industry, and that's how we've gotten to know him. And in the last 14, working with projects to monetize RNG, and has had some success working with King County South Wastewater Treatment Plant, the King County Landfill, and the City of Tacoma Wastewater Treatment Plant. So with that, Ralph, and then he's going to just share with us kind of the nuts and bolts of RNG development, and all that goes into that process. So I'll leave that to you, Ralph.
Thanks, Scott. And by the way, I'm open to either, having a dialogue while I'm presenting or questions at the end, either way, however you want to do it. So
if I see questions, I'll kind of do it as we go. But then I'll open it up at the end for people, but like I just did, I'll on the occasion interrupt you with a question.
And that sounds good, Scott. Welcome. Thanks, everybody. Happy to be on today talking about RNG projects, renewable gas projects. A little bit more on my background. I worked with BP on doing offtakes it allowed a lot of projects to get built in the Northwest. And it was interesting time, very infant stages of it, but learned a lot, made a lot of contacts. When I retired in 2019, I set up my own company because I felt like there was more to do out there. I wasn't done working entirely, and got partnerships together with people who are smarter than me to pursue some of these projects, see if we could get some projects built. And I won't spend a lot of time promoting, but there'll be a couple slides in here on the project that we have started construction on. It's kind of interesting. So from there, we'll get started. I'm going to talk a little bit about just the requirements of project development and the pitfalls of that you run into as you're trying to develop these projects. Briefly talk about types of projects in the region, and also the relationship of the markets to project types and funding. It's pretty important. What are some of the newly developing project types and market types as well? And then a little bit on competition, challenges, and extraneous items as you develop a project. Finally, certainly not last but not least, is the Inflation Reduction Act and the impact it's having. Talk a little bit about that. We formed a partnership early on. SEV is only 4 people. I have 3 partners, but one of the partners, Rick Redmond, was the CEO of Summit Power, who developed gas projects, wind and solar projects for a lot of years. And through the relationship with Rick, he knows a lot of people that have developed energy projects over time. So the remaining partners of SEV are people that he's known over the years. At the same time, we partnered with a company by the name of Burnham RNG, and Burnham's out of Washington, D.C. Burnham is funded by Edge Natural Resources, which is an oil and gas hedge fund or private equity fund. And Burnham is a growth company trying to develop many multiples of RNG projects. And the way that we work is we originate projects for Burnham, and they develop a fund and build them. And it's been a good partnership. And our first project that's achieved a financial notice to proceed is under construction, is at the City of Pasco Resource Recovery Center. And it's a kind of a unique project in that it has half dozen or so food processing companies, potato processing, vegetable processing, and probably the biggest instigator of a project here was Dairy Gold announcing its $500 million processing plant to join this group of processors. In the past, what they have done with this waste streams, and it's up to 10 million gallons a day of wastewater, is to store it in the winter and spread it during the rest of the year on acreage near the processing center. It's out east of the airport at Pasco. And the problem with that, or the challenge, was that there were raising nitrogen levels in the groundwater, nutrient level problems with the Department of Ecology. When we came in, we suggested that, first of all, there's energy in the waste stream. Secondly, we can add a process to reduce the nitrogen in the waste streams as well. The digester part of this project is two 35 million gallon low rate anaerobic digesters. They're huge. The project, the revenue stream from the renewable gas doesn't support the entire project, but it certainly offset the costs of removing the nitrogen. So it's under construction, anticipated to be commercial by the end of next year. And so far successful. We raised $150 million. We got the project rated and raised $150 million in bond funds to support the funding of the project. We did a 20-year offtake that helped with the interconnect costs as well. So some of the requirements of project development, I mean, I think obviously funding drives projects. And it's not just the funding of the project itself, but it is costly to get these projects in through pre-development to a point where you can reduce a lot of the risks and issue a notice to proceed funding to fund the projects. So you've got to have capital behind you as a company to develop these projects. And that has to do with the marketing of renewable gas too as well. The dairy project has a OCI score and has a very high value in the transportation markets, RINs and low carbon fuel standard markets, EPA, RFS market, and low carbon fuel standard markets. The challenge with those markets is that the regulators like to play with them, if you will. And so there's risk in those markets and the pricing is volatile. So the risk expected for these types of projects are different and higher and different funding altogether. Some of the basic, whereas the difference between that and say a food waste project like the Pasco project is that we've got a long-term fixed price offtake on the RNG, which allows for a lower return expectation from the investors and a more stable funding. Well, not more stable funding, but a different type of funding. So basic requirements, obviously you have to have a site under some kind of option agreement or agreement. Excuse me. A feedstock is probably, if not the most important, one of the most important things. And you know, there's a lot that goes into a feedstock agreement to make it long-term and secure. And then the market offtake is also very important to have a long-term agreement for offtake. And that's been sort of my expertise in these projects. Access to a gas system, and I will say that there isn't it's interesting that in all the agricultural areas, there's not a great amount of infrastructure on the gas side. So it can become difficult to locate a project in the right location. What comes out of the back end of the digester is it's important to have an outlet for that. Although if you're interrupting a waste stream and putting it through a digester, that waste stream could be what was used prior for fertilizer. So typically there's a way to get rid of the offtake. But it's not a big, it's not included as a big revenue stream for projects. I think that could change over time, but right now it's not. Permitting is very important, obviously. We have a group that pursues that, and carbon intensity of the project is also important. Although I will say that the utilities in their offtake agreements don't really describe that or value it very much. I do think it will become important over time. We'll talk more about that later. So in the region, there's really only one dairy project that's been built in Washington. None in Oregon that I'm aware of. Several in Idaho, quite a few in Idaho. Wastewater treatment plants, mostly municipally owned. And a lot of them are small, but certainly some of the bigger ones, like the city of Tacoma, King County, are able to do something with cleaning up their processed gas and putting it into the pipeline. Others like Pasco, we're trying to find duplications of Pasco. It's hard to find, but we're developing additional projects similar to Pasco. We talked about energy content, nutrient levels already. Landfill projects, you're going to see more and more landfill projects. The recent purchase of Archaea by BP in a joint venture with Republic, I know, is forwarding more projects on the Republic side, and I know Waste Management has a few hundred landfills that don't have projects on them. So you are going to see more landfill projects. And food waste is coming to the forefront, mostly on a coastal basis, but we are actually involved in a couple projects in the Midwest on a food waste basis. And these are having to do with food processing waste, processors that have bad batches of food and things like that. There's two types, pre-consumer and post-consumer waste. You're starting to see some things pop up on the pre-consumer side, certainly, with Divert, and they're with Kroger's. And then on the post-consumer side, landfill diversion laws on the coast are starting to drive projects primarily in California, but I think you'll see those in the Northwest as well. On the other biomass category, wood waste is of interest, but I will say that it seems like there's higher value pursuits of wood waste with liquid products. On the market side, funding, I talked briefly about compliance markets, regulatory driven and risky, being regulatory driven and risky. They're also, in my opinion, environmentally challenged by the electrification folks who are trying to change the rules. For example, in California, they're considering a change to eliminate avoided emissions credits for dairy projects. And also geopolitical, by that I mean book and claim accounting. They're attacking book and claim accounting, which most of you probably know is a way for a gas project to be built anywhere in North America and reach a market in California or elsewhere. That to me is more of a local jobs issue, but it'll be interesting in California because they're raising their targets near-term targets for carbon reduction of transportation fuels, but limiting the choices by their policies. I think that's going to lead to much higher prices in those markets. Carbon intensity matters in these markets, and certainly they have higher values because of that, and higher expected returns because of the higher risk. So voluntary markets, primarily gas utilities, but corporates are starting to get involved, and it's becoming somewhat globally driven. I'm receiving interest from LNG exporters and methanol exporters as to reduce their carbon footprint of their own products that are being shipped to Europe and Asia. And, you know, the newest thing really is the hydrogen projects, which there are several of those, that more than several, there's hundreds of those. How many will be successful? Hard to say, but a lot of them are looking to renewable gas to lower their carbon footprint in order to receive the credits that they need to make the projects work. So there's more markets, no shortage of markets, and I think there's been good direction on pricing and terms and so forth that allow utilities and others to negotiate contracts.
Hey, Ralph, this is Scott there. Kevin in the chat is asking, does carbon intensity mean the carbon required to build and drive the process?
It's a combination of if there are any avoided methane emissions from doing a project. For example, on a dairy, that's primarily where this comes into play. If the dairy has a big lagoon that's collecting manure and emitting methane, and what you're doing is coming in to interrupt that process and take the energy content out, take the methane out of the manure prior to putting it back in the lagoon, then you're avoiding those methane emissions. So that's what drives the big negative numbers. And then it's a combination of that versus the energy required of the project. So how much electricity, what's the makeup of the electricity? Is it coal-based, natural gas-based, hydro-based? Those things go into the GREET model, which is used pretty extensively in the US from Argonne National Labs, and it calculates a carbon intensity of the RNG that you're producing. Does that answer the question? Hopefully.
I mean, so given an example, Ralph, of
Sure.
like a CI score, compare a CI score for a landfill project versus a dairy project.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Scott. The landfill projects are typically in the positive 40 to 50 carbon intensity range. And what does that compare to? So the carbon intensity, what you're doing in the transportation market is you're getting credit versus burning gasoline or burning diesel. Now, actually, you need to take it a step further, because if you're putting RNG into a vehicle, it's a CNG vehicle or an LNG vehicle, which is already less carbon intense than gasoline or diesel. So gasoline or diesel numbers probably in the plus 88, plus 90 range, 95, and it varies over time. Natural gas vehicle is in the plus 75, 78 range, thereabouts. So you already get a small reduction just by burning natural gas in the vehicle. But by putting RNG in it, now you're comparing a landfill at plus 40 to 50 to plus 80 or plus 75 of a natural gas vehicle. And those are the credits that are generated that you can sell into the low carbon fuel standard market for revenue. Wastewater treatment plants are typically plus 20, plus 30. food waste projects do get some avoided methane emissions credits and can end up in the -50 to -100 level. Hopefully that gives us scope. And the dairy projects, anywhere from -150 to -350, -400.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ralph.
Okay. Newly developing projects and markets, Pasco, obviously that's a kind of a unique one. We think there's ways to duplicate that or something similar where it's a combination of an energy project and a groundwater purity project, or you're trying to solve other issues that the waste streams have, so that the RNG doesn't have to pay for the entire project. There's something else you're trying to solve here. Food waste is being somewhat driven by landfill diversion laws. And the recent set rule change at the EPA, which is hoping to clear up the ability for wastewater treatment plants to take in food waste, will likely drive some projects, although I'm a bit skeptical about the way they landed on the economics, whether it's really going to drive anything. Because wastewater treatment plants are a natural place to take in food waste and generate more energy. But because of their designation as a D3 RIN, whereas food waste is considered non-cellulosic or a D5 category RIN, much lower values, people have been reluctant to jeopardize their D3 RIN status on a wastewater treatment plant. The set rule is supposed to address that, but the guidelines are still being written. We'll know more later. And then on the back end, I think there's some things going on, certainly with biosolids. Every wastewater treatment plant has biosolids they have to dispose of. They're class A or class B. They have, you've probably heard about PFAS chemicals, which is becoming a huge issue with the EPA and will probably become even a bigger issue. And one way to handle these biosolids or dispose of them and also create renewable gases to create biochar through a pyrolysis process. So some of that's starting to pop up here and there. It's very infant stages at this point, but those are some projects that are trying to happen in the newly developing area. We're seeing the LCFS market in the state of Washington develop a little bit. It's got a ways to go. I think it's going to be a big market because you've got certainly all the half dozen or so refineries in the northwest part of the state that are credit buyers, and they'll all be doing things to support the generation of credits in that market. And then the Canadian, it's not called the LCFS market. I think it's called the Clean Fuels market. I haven't looked into that a lot, but Canadians are a little more aggressive about implementing natural gas vehicles, so it could be a big market as well. I mentioned methanol export to Europe. We've got inquiries from existing methanol producers that want to buy RNG, will be buying RNG, mostly in the Gulf Coast. There'll be certain types of projects I think that will work with, because the certification of the feedstock is very important to make sure that what they're buying is renewable and has the value that they think it does. We're getting some inquiries from existing LNG export companies for similar reasons, reduce carbon footprint of the LNG they're exporting. And then shipping, we've seen some shipping inquiries, both on the methanol side, which is a growing fuel in the shipping industry, and the LNG side, which also is a growing fuel in the shipping industry. And that's being driven primarily by the ESG goals of their customers at this point. So Walmart, for example, wants to know that their products being shipped are being shipped with a low carbon footprint. And lastly, again, is hydrogen. These hydrogen projects, how many will get built? No way to know, but a lot of them are requesting and wanting RNG to reduce their carbon footprint. So one thing I would say to gas utility buyers, which have been sort of the first compliance or voluntary markets out there, I should say, is you need to try to find ways to be flexible in your contracts to allow these projects to achieve upside in other markets or to do other things as they can in order to compete for some of this RNG, because there's way more buyers than there is production. Some of the challenges in the competition, I mean, competition's out there. There's a lot of money chasing these projects, and we run into it every day. The challenges, projects we talked a little bit about, feedstock, securing long-term commitments. It's not easy to do. I think that, you need 10 to 20-year agreements to take some of the risk off the table for funding. Tipping fees can be important depending on the type of project. And a tipping fee is basically what would you get paid to take the feedstock and turn it into RNG? And why would you get paid? Well, you'd get paid because they're having to put it in a landfill, for example, and pay $100 a ton, let's say. So can you get a piece of that tipping fee? Challenge there is with some of these agricultural projects is that there are other uses for the feedstock. They primarily as a cattle feed, and it typically doesn't cost. It costs something, but it doesn't cost a lot to get rid of it. Inflation's been a challenge over the last year, so I think things are settling down on that front a little bit. And then I mentioned earlier, but like Eastern Washington, for example, we're putting some projects together, and it's just a bit difficult to find solid gas infrastructure in the areas where the agricultural waste is. It's not great. It's not everywhere. That's not the case everywhere in the U.S., but in the Northwest, I think it is a challenge. Mentioned market price risk earlier. I won't go back over that. It's just a volatile market in the transportation markets. The voluntary market, long-term fixed price, de-risks that significantly. And the regulatory risk of these markets, seem to be constantly being tweaked with. So that creates a challenge for investors. Pushback from electrify everything folks. They just don't like RNG because they feel it supports fossil gas, even though it's decarbonizing the fossil footprint. It's kind of an interesting argument. And then other items, the woody biomass, again, competition from liquid fuels. There's a lot of people chasing liquid fuels markets. I have a subsidiary called Sustainable Syngas, and we're pursuing wood waste to a biomethanol project down in Gulf Coast. Values are much higher, costs are higher, but values are much higher than trying to create RNG out of biomass. I will say that if we could sell syngas and not take it all the way to biomethane and have that qualify as a direct use, that'd be a way to decarbonize industrial loads at a somewhat reasonable cost. The battle against book and claim accounting is ridiculous, in my opinion. It's basically trying to say that you have to transport the biogas from point A to the production point to the end use point in order to get the credit. Most people know that gas flows where it flows. It doesn't matter, even if you have a transportation contract that says it's going from point A to point B, that's not where it's going. So it's a bit of a ridiculous argument to try and get rid of book and claim accounting. Inflation Reduction Act is a big driver right now, and I think it's important to point out up to 50% investment tax credit. Now, in most areas, probably 30% will achieve fairly simply. There has to be an apprenticeship program with the project, and you have to pay prevailing wage. Both of those we feel are achievable. There is an adder for domestic content. May or may not get that, depending on your project type and where you're getting your equipment. And the question really is, are there enough tax credit buyers? We helped start a company called Ever.Green, if you want to look that up, and they're pursuing online platform to help corporate buyers monetize tax credits. There are monetization losses also in this business. So as a startup company developing RNG projects, we're not profitable yet, so we can't take advantage of these tax credits, so we have to sell them to somebody. And so there will be a broker scrape, if you want to call it that, or in order to, you might get 80% of that value. So that's a bit of a challenge. I think one of the bigger difficulties right now is that you have to get the project under construction by the end of 2024 in order to qualify for the investment tax credit. Like most things political, maybe that gets pushed out a little bit. And the production tax credit starts in 2025 as well, and that's an adder to the investment tax credits on top of the investment tax credit for 3 years. It's based on carbon intensity of the project, so the values can be quite high for a negative carbon intensity project. There's some doubt in my mind as to the application, simply because it talks about the renewable gas being available or having the ability to be a transportation fuel. Well, that needs to be defined. We've had a couple of legal opinions that have said that they think it means it applies to any market, any buyer of RNG, doesn't have to go into a vehicle. I'd like to see that come through in the rulemaking. And, another challenge is that they've pushed the rulemaking. It's not required until the beginning of 2025. So as you can imagine, as a developer, you're trying to plan for this. You won't even know the rules potentially until the beginning of 2025 when the tax credit is supposed to start. I don't know how you plan for that. It's difficult. That's all I had. If there's any questions or comments.
Let's see, there are none in the chat. One question I had was earlier you mentioned you thought there were more people chasing credits than credits being produced. Is that so? In other words, there's still opportunity for RNG development.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's there's not enough production out there. I do think that I'm hearing that the transportation markets are starting to fill up a bit, but I think part of that is just a bit of slowdown of CNG vehicle growth, perhaps due to the inflation. I mean, there's been some commitments on long haul trucking in particular that haven't been totally implemented yet. So I think that market will grow. Will grow. It's just been slow growing over the last year or so.
Yeah, well, Washington will be a new opportunity once that's fully implemented.
Yeah, and I do think the advent of the Cummins 15-liter natural gas engine will be a game changer for the long haul transport market. So hopefully that'll get things moving again on the transport side. But the voluntary markets are big and getting bigger every day.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question. The talking heads suggest that December 2024 timeframe will not be extended. I assume that means the projects need to break ground by 2024.
Yeah, and there's some I think the definition of starting construction can be ordering a big piece of equipment, for example. So I don't think it's that you need to necessarily have a cat out there breaking ground, but you're going to have to do something major on a construction standpoint. And the problem, the challenge is just going through pre-development of a project can take 6 months. It can take longer. So, and now's the time, if you're going to do a project, you got to get after it.
Yeah. Yeah, if we're easy, everyone would do it.
God, as you know.
Yeah, the other issue too is, with the rules not potentially not being finished till the end of 2024, and you have to make, investment decisions or equipment buying decisions in time to, qualify.
Yeah.
But then the other thing is the production tax credit is only for 3 years at this point, although, certainly people are talking about that being extended even before the end of this year. I hope before we get into election season, but so that's a possibility. But if it's only 3 years, then every month after January 2025 that you're not in production, you're losing money.
Absolutely. Yeah, no guarantee it'll be extended, but we've seen that in the wind side, certainly, solar side.
Yeah.
Will that happen? I don't know.
Yeah, still lots of questions to be answered about the IRA. A lot of attorney fees being spent trying to predict what it's going to mean. But let's see. Then you were talking about the CI score. I should have written down my questions. At the end you were saying that the CI score is important for the IRA. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a formula for calculation of the credit that was in the regulations, and it's based on a carbon intensity of plus 50. So the formula is basically the carbon intensity minus 50 divided by 50. That becomes the multiplier. So if the carbon intensity is minus 100 and you subtract 50 from that, now you're minus 150 divided by 50. Your multiplier is 3. And the multiplier is times an energy value of almost $8 per MMBTU. So on a dairy project that's say minus 150, and we don't know how they're going to, we think what's going to happen is that they're going to put out a table of carbon intensities for types of projects. So they're not going to have everyone have to go through a calculation of carbon intensity on their project. And based on what's been done in the LCFS program in California, we could see a minus 150 baseline carbon intensity for a dairy project. If that's the case, then the multiplier is 4, and the value achieved through the production tax credit would be $32 per MMBTU for 3 years. Now, it becomes very much less important for, say, a wastewater treatment plant that might be plus 30. Now your multiplier is actually a fraction of the $8, as opposed to a multiple of the $8. So very much dependent on what is the table that they put out? What's that going to say?
Yeah, there's still just a lot of unanswered questions there. And then you were talking about even foreign LNG developers, exporters, being a potential market for American RNG. That's something I haven't really looked into before. What's that opportunity? I mean, like, for example, I know domestically, like renewable diesel projects are looking at RNG to reduce their CI score. I mean, because that process requires heat, which they use natural gas for. So, there's opportunities there, but I haven't heard anything about LNG.
Yeah, I'm just hearing conversations. I haven't dug into it too deep, but I'm hearing conversations that LNG buyers are starting to inquire about RNG for export. And it could be for RED 2 in Europe, the energy directive in Europe. It could be for Asia. It could be just pushback on fossil fuels and in general, and the fact that, all the LNG is from fossil natural gas.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know the details of that, Scott, just that I've been hearing some inquiries on RNG for LNG export.
Yeah, no, I was curious.
Same thing with methanol. Methanol, though, is directed at RED 2. So there's some transportation uses of methanol in Europe. And so it's a reduction of carbon intensity for their methanol so that they can achieve credits in Europe, which sometimes have higher value than here.
All right. Any other questions from our group here? Chat or put your thumb up or just ask. I could,
pretty quiet group.
yeah.
I will say that we're looking to add more projects, primarily because the investment tax credit right now. So we've got a really good development group. We think we cover all the bases from A to Z. And if you want us involved in looking at a project for you, we'd be happy to take a look at it and see if it makes sense.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure. All right, Judy.
Thanks, Ralph, for the presentation today. Ralph has agreed to make his presentation available. I'll send that around later today. Once I get the video posted, you'll get a link for the webinar today and his slides. So if there's no more questions, we're going to go ahead and let Ralph get back to his afternoon, and thank all of you for showing up.